What if the fate of Europe had pivoted on a single moment of ambition, one man's refusal to accept humiliation? Imagine a world where Napoleon III, long overshadowed by the legends of his uncle, seized the opportunity to reshape the continent itself. In this alternate timeline, the French Empire does not collapse under Prussian steel. Instead, it claws its way back to supremacy, dragging all of Europe into a completely different future. This is the story of the war that could have rewritten the map of the world. After several failed attempts to revive the imperial crown, Louis Napoleon finally rose to power as the first president of the Second French Republic after the 1848 Revolution. Just 3 years later, claiming that France needed stability above all else, he orchestrated a coup d'etat. With an overwhelming 92% of public support behind him, he crowned himself the second French emperor on December 2, 1852. But the new emperor soon collided with a rising force to the east. Prussia had humiliated Austria during the 1866 Brothers' War, and Otto von Bismarck, the calculating Prussian chancellor, sought to tighten a noose around France by placing a Hohenzollern prince on the Spanish throne. Napoleon III believed France's honor and its historic borders were under threat. He declared war, convinced the moment had come to reclaim lost prestige. On July 19, 1870, the Franco-Prussian War erupted. Europe's great powers expected France to sweep aside the arrogant Prussians with ease. Instead, the French military collapsed with shocking speed. By October, the empire disintegrated and the Bonapartes fled to England. Prussia then proclaimed the German Empire, shattering Europe's balance of power, securing the priceless Rhineland, and setting the stage for the world wars to come. But history, at least in this version, took a sharp turn in 1866. After witnessing Austria's humiliation, Napoleon III finally confronted the corruption and inefficiency rotting the Second Empire from within. Generals Ducrot and Trochu's desperate warnings were heeded, triggering sweeping military reforms. In 1868, he forced through the unedited Loi Niel, creating a conscript-based mobile guard modeled after Prussia instead of relying solely on professionals. The Garde Mobile expanded to some 400,000 men, as all able-bodied Frenchmen were required to serve 5 years actively and 4 in reserve, with no exceptions. France prepared meticulously. Stock depots were filled with food, ammunition, and France's superior small arms, ready for any clash with Germany. Napoleon III appointed Edmond Lebeuf as commander of the Army of the Rhine, instructing him to strike Prussian units first while treating non-Prussian Germans more kindly, hoping they might defect once French troops crossed into Germany. When war finally broke out in July 1870, Saarbrücken fell to the French on the 31st. The Battle of Wissembourg opened the conflict, with early Prussian success overturned once French reinforcements retook the city within 2 days. Even Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm was captured, electrifying French morale. French troops surged into the southern Rhineland, seizing strategic towns by late August. Back in Paris, Empress Eugenie kept the 14,000-man garrison in Rome to guard the Pope, believing the war was firmly in France's favor. The Moselle and Rhine crystallized into the new front line as the French dug in, compelling Prussian forces to crash repeatedly against fortified positions. These defenses amplified the deadly range of the Raffier mitrailleuse, France's early machine gun, turning German assaults into blood-soaked slaughters where half their number fell before reaching French lines. Wave after wave of near-suicidal Prussian attacks bought France vital time. Supplies flowed to the front, and the French army gained the initiative. Desperate for a breakthrough, General von Steinmetz impulsively marched the Prussian First Army through Luxembourg. Confusion spread among his officers, communication broke down, and many units wandered into the Benelux, falling perfectly into French plans. International opinion turned sharply against Prussia. Russia abandoned its secret anti-Austrian pact, and Britain issued a stern ultimatum demanding Prussia withdraw, even considering war before ultimately stepping back. Still, Bismarck refused to lose face. Determined to salvage the situation, he pushed for a bold move: the conquest of Belgium. Liège fell on August 20, followed by a Prussian victory at Gezetz, and Charleroi came under siege on September 2nd. Napoleon III moved his forces into Belgium under the pretense of protecting their neighbors, after Leopold II agreed to minor territorial concessions. Luxembourg became a killing field. At Edelbruck, Prussian forces were wiped out, and at Mersch, both sides suffered staggering losses before French troops expelled the Germans completely. The Prussians pushed deeper into Belgium, clashing at Saint-Hubert before falling back to regroup around Hainaut. They seized Leuven, threatening Brussels itself, and Leopold II secretly promised to cede Wallonia if France expelled the invaders, formalized in the covert Tuileries Agreement. French forces liberated Charleroi quickly. Meanwhile, their comrades were driven from Hainaut to Waterloo, and after 2 days, the situation grew dire. The Prussians appeared on the brink of victory on the 29th, but von Steinmetz's scouts failed to notice a brigade led by the young Crown Prince Louis Napoleon. Outflanking the Prussian line, his men smashed into their flank, delivering a victory that instantly became legendary. All of Europe felt the shock. A Bonaparte had avenged Waterloo. The Crown Prince assumed supreme command in Belgium, turning the tide. He retook Leuven and Liège, pushing German forces back to Aix-la-Chapelle. The disastrous Prussian campaign shook the southern German states. Bavaria and Saxony began secret peace talks, offering to re-establish Bavaria's Napoleonic-era western borders, though negotiations collapsed in Munich. Aix-la-Chapelle, Charlemagne's ancient capital, held enormous symbolic weight for both sides. Prussian troops fortified the city, withdrawing from the Moselle and leaving Saxons to cover their retreat. Disaster struck when 2 French divisions encircled the Saxons at Nuremberg Castle on October 11. The partially restored fortress, ruined during the Napoleonic Wars, was overwhelmed. 13,000 Saxons, half their army, surrendered, enraging von Moltke. The French surrounded Aix-la-Chapelle. Napoleon III offered generous peace terms, but the Prussians dismissed his proposal with icy arrogance. Aachen will defend itself to the last soldier, biscuit, and cartridge. 16 days later, on October 19, the city fell. 32,000 Germans were captured, with many others dying in bitter last stands. The defeat forced Prussian armies to pull back to Cologne, the final major stronghold west of the Rhine. The French advanced carefully, wary of overextension. Even so, 2 brigades outpaced supply lines and were annihilated at Weilerswist on October 23, losing 20,000 men. The next day, the Belgian front's army arrived and pushed the Prussians into Cologne. French forces massed outside the city, and the siege began on October 25. Napoleon III issued fresh peace terms, tempting Wilhelm I, but Bismarck urged the king to resist, insisting the tide was about to turn. Most of Europe disagreed. Russia and Britain believed France would soon invade Germany itself, leading to even harsher consequences for Prussia. Meanwhile, Saxony, Baden, and Bavaria withdrew their troops from Cologne, sensing disaster. King John of Saxony, who had sided with Austria in 1866, signaled he would join France if Austria entered the conflict. 11,000 Saxon troops were rushed back to Dresden, alarming Prussian command. On December 2nd, Cologne fell. Riots erupted in Berlin, crushed only after Bismarck personally intervened and assured Wilhelm that Prussia still had options, though few believed him. Denmark, still burning from its humiliation in the Second Schleswig War of 1864, sensed its chance for payback. As France rose against Prussia, Copenhagen began mobilizing its forces, and Napoleon III dispatched a French army north to aid the Danes. But on December 8th, the long-dreaded Prussian counterstrike erupted across the Rhine. The attacks were ferocious. Cologne, Mainz, and Koblenz were shattered by German artillery, with Prussia devastating its own former territories in a frantic attempt to break the French grip. Civilian casualties mounted on a horrifying scale, shocking the world and destroying what little international sympathy Prussia still had. Meanwhile, Austria, watching Prussia's uncontrolled brutality with disgust, mobilized its forces and sought to rally the allies of the Old Brothers' War. Negotiations succeeded. France and Austria signed the Hofburg Accord, committing to total victory over Prussia and pledging mutual defense against Italy. Then, on January 11, Denmark formally declared war, sweeping into Schleswig-Holstein. Schleswig and Kiel fell quickly, and Lübeck soon found itself under siege. On January 18th, Emperor Franz Joseph entered the war, joined by Ludwig II of Bavaria, Frederick I of Baden, Louis III of Hesse, and King John of Saxony, every one of them longtime enemies of Prussia since 1866. Only Charles I of Württemberg remained faithful to Berlin, prompting Napoleon III to agree that Württemberg would be partitioned after the war. What followed was a grim echo of the Brothers' War, but this time France stood by Austria. Bismarck, realizing the noose was tightening, begged Russia to honor its secret anti-Austrian agreement, but internal turmoil had weakened the Tsar's authority, and Russia refused to intervene. With no support left, the Iron Chancellor attempted to salvage peace, but Napoleon III's new terms were uncompromising: sweeping territorial losses and the dismantling of the North German Confederation. Prussia refused, but many German soldiers knew they were fighting to the last man, while Bismarck publicly railed against the laziness of the southern states. On January 22nd, Lübeck capitulated to Denmark. Austria stormed into Saxony and, with the Danes, overwhelmed Prussian forces at Leipzig. Austrian armies advanced into Silesia, taking Ratibor without resistance. French offensives opened simultaneously. Düsseldorf and Dortmund fell, and after a stubborn 2-week defense, Oppeln also surrendered. The Prussians hit back at Ohlau on February 16th, pushing the French momentarily, but they were hopelessly outnumbered as the coalition grew larger by the week. More and more German troops began fighting alongside the French, liberating Gießen together. With Württemberg's army away fighting for Prussia, Bavaria and Baden marched unopposed into Stuttgart, dissolving the kingdom and deposing the deeply unpopular Charles I, a move celebrated by many German princes. France encircled Hamburg while the Danes advanced toward Schwerin. They were pushed back twice, once on February 19th and again days later, losing 18,000 men. Even so, French troops abandoned the siege of Hamburg to combine with the Danes at Lauenburg, crushing Prussian units there before returning to complete the Hamburg siege. The Southern Coalition continued its sweep, capturing Brunswick and triggering an uprising in Hanover. 5 days later, the Bavarians took Fulda, sealing off Prussia's southern approach. Baden and Hesse-Darmstadt joined them in besieging Kassel, which surrendered on March 2nd. Austria surged northward, smashing Prussian forces at Waldenburg and driving them back to Breslau. The siege of Breslau began 6 days later, just as Russia unexpectedly mobilized 38,000 troops. Bavarian forces pushed east, seizing Halle, while Nassau defected to the coalition. Brunswick fell on March 16th, Munster on the 18th. France pushed north but suffered a repulse at Osnabrück on the 22nd, only to return and take the city on the 30th. German forces were beaten again at Elsten on April 8th. Stettin fell to Denmark on April 10, and Danish troops marched south toward Berlin, forcing Wilhelm to flee to Königsberg. In the west, France finally seized Hamburg and joined with coalition forces to take Oldenburg. Wittenberg fell to the southern Germans on the 19th, and Breslau collapsed on the 28th. A small Prussian force was crushed at Wichau on June 9. Then came the final catastrophe. Russia declared war on Prussia, seizing the opportunity for a shameless land grab ordered by Alexander II. The Russians raced through Poznan and besieged the city. By June 23, Berlin was encircled. A week later, Poznan fell. Russia's sole objective was clear: to occupy the old Duchy of Warsaw and prevent France from carving out a Polish state that might stir unrest in Russian-held Warsaw. Finally, on June 30, Danish troops captured Berlin itself. Prussia, once Europe's rising titan, was defeated and disgraced. The Treaty of Dresden, ratified on August 6, 1871, redrew the map of Europe. France annexed southern Limburg, Luxembourg, and the entire German Rhineland. True to the Tuileries Agreement, France absorbed Wallonia, while Leopold became King of Flanders. The Netherlands expanded to the Ems River and received Cleves as compensation for losing Luxembourg. The North German Confederation was dissolved, and nearly everything west of the Elbe was stripped away. Several new states were carved out, with Westphalia the largest. In Hanover, George V, dethroned 6 years earlier, was restored thanks to his anti-Prussian, pro-French stance and royal British connections. Denmark gained Schleswig-Holstein and all former Swedish Pomeranian lands around Stettin.
Saxony regained its broader Napoleonic borders. Bavaria and Baden carved up Württemberg and expanded northward, with Baden elevated to a kingdom. Austria reclaimed Silesia, reversing Frederick the Great's most famous conquest, while Russia solidified its hold on Poznan. Prussia's collapse was total. It lost its industrial heartlands and 72% of its population, shrinking from 27 million to barely 7.5 million, only marginally larger than Bavaria. A new German Federation emerged without Prussia. Austria was the natural leader, but Hungary blocked this, fearing diminished influence within the dual monarchy. Denmark seized the moment and joined the federation, becoming its de facto head. Power remained balanced between Denmark, Bavaria, Saxony, Westphalia, and Hanover, making German unification impossible. Friedrich Ferdinand von Beust, the brilliant statesman who once served both Saxony and Austria, became the federation's first chancellor. A fierce opponent of Prussian dominance, he championed the independence of the German states, just as he had argued during the Bamberg conferences of 1854. Von Beust had also played a crucial diplomatic role in aligning Austria and Saxony with France before the war. Great Britain, alarmed by the emerging French, Austrian, Russian alignment, scrambled to restore balance and began supporting Italy, now the natural counterweight to French power since Prussia had fallen. Napoleon III returned to Paris triumphant and immediately ordered the construction of a colossal monument on the Champ de Mars, intended to surpass even his uncle's Arc de Triomphe.
But on January 9, 1873, he died. By then, his legacy had eclipsed Napoleon I. He had expanded French borders dramatically, halted German unification, preserved the papacy, transformed Paris into the City of Lights, fueled industrial growth, and, most importantly, knew when to stop. His heir, the 16-year-old Louis Napoleon, the war hero of Belgium, now ascended as Emperor of France. Empress Eugenie, who had effectively governed since the mid-1860s, became regent until he reached adulthood. She immediately began the search for a future empress. Louis Napoleon was immensely popular, disciplined, respectful, and devoutly Catholic, with Pope Pius IX as his godfather. Bold and eager to prove himself worthy of the Bonaparte legacy, he possessed a flawless command of French law. Unexpectedly, he was also pro-British and adored by both the royal family and the common people of Great Britain. The best description of Louis Napoleon was simple: loyal to his God, his country, and himself. On December 2, 1874, exactly 70 years after the first Napoleon crowned himself emperor, Louis Napoleon ascended the throne as Napoleon IV, anointed at Notre Dame by Pope Pius IX. Although he now wore the imperial crown, Empress Eugenie still held enormous political influence in Paris. The young emperor's first mission was clear: he needed a bride. Several dynasties presented candidates. Austria offered Archduchess Gisela Louise Marie. Russia had no suitable daughter of similar age, eliminating a Romanov match. Unexpectedly, he was also pro-British and adored by both the royal family and the common people of Great Britain. The best description of Louis Napoleon was simple: loyal to his God, his country, and himself. On December 2, 1874, exactly 70 years after the first Napoleon crowned himself emperor, Louis Napoleon ascended the throne as Napoleon IV, anointed at Notre Dame by Pope Pius IX. Although he now wore the imperial crown, Empress Eugenie still held enormous political influence in Paris. The young emperor's first mission was clear: he needed a bride. Several dynasties presented candidates. Austria offered Archduchess Gisela Louise Marie. Russia had no suitable daughter of similar age, eliminating a Romanov match. And across the Channel was the most intriguing option of all, Princess Beatrice of Great Britain. In real history, the two came close to marriage, and in this alternate timeline, fate again draws them together. Despite the ancient rivalry between Britain and France, Napoleon IV courted Beatrice with confidence. Queen Victoria, who had taken a genuine interest in the young emperor's education, was charmed by his manners and potential. She believed, perhaps naively, that such a union might anchor peace not only between Britain and France, but across Europe itself. Eventually, she granted approval, as required by the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. Beatrice converted to Catholicism, and in 1878 the marriage took place, sealing a historic alliance between former enemies. As a gesture of goodwill to his new mother-in-law, Napoleon IV sent a regiment to South Africa to aid the British against the Zulus, a symbolic gift that delighted Queen Victoria. Anglo-French relations flourished, trade surged, and both nations enjoyed the prosperity that followed. Empress Eugenie, long determined to legitimize the Bonaparte dynasty once and for all, had finally achieved her dream. With Beatrice on the throne, the Bourbon and Orleanist factions faded into irrelevance. But the marriage caused ripples far beyond Paris. Russia was unsettled. St. Petersburg had hoped to build an anti-British coalition with France and Austria to support a push toward India. Italy grew anxious as well. Britain had been Rome's strongest backer, and the new marriage destroyed any hope of capturing Rome, since Napoleon IV remained a fervent defender of papal authority. For France, however, the newly acquired territories remained the empire's greatest treasure. The Rhineland, once hailed as the richest jewel in Prussia's crown, became the engine of French industrial power. Its vast mineral wealth, coal, iron, lead, zinc, fueled modernization on a scale Prussia once dreamed of. Cities like Aix-la-Chapelle, Essen, Oberhausen, Duisburg, and Cologne proved indispensable, accelerating France's industrial rise until it began to rival Britain itself. The region's dense, mostly Catholic population facilitated smoother integration. Young Frenchmen were encouraged to marry Rhineland women, slowly weaving French culture and language deeper into the region while diluting the Germanic identity that might someday harbor revanchism. Colossal fortifications soon lined the frontier, designed to crush any future German resurgence before it could begin. Then came the Balkan uprisings. The Ottoman Empire's brutal retaliation in Bulgaria shocked Europe. Russia declared war to protect its Slavic Orthodox kin, defeating the Ottomans with ease and advancing all the way to the gates of Constantinople. Austria seized Bosnia in the chaos. Concerned this war might reshape the map too violently, France and Britain sent their fleets to guarantee Ottoman survival, forcing new borders to be drawn at the Congress of Munich in 1878. The Ottomans, desperate to appease the great powers, quietly struck deals. Cyprus would go to France, while Crete, restless since its 1866 revolt, would be promised to Britain. In return, both powers supported the Sultan at the conference. Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gained independence. Russia annexed southern Bessarabia. Romania received northern Dobruja. Greece, which had trusted British diplomacy and avoided the war, was awarded Thessaly and Arta. Napoleon IV, eager to expand France's global presence like his predecessors, oversaw the conquest of Tunisia in 1881. Meanwhile, Egypt became the next grand prize. France blocked Britain from purchasing the Khedive's Suez Canal shares in 1875. Société Générale outbid London and secured French control. When Colonel Ahmed Arabi launched his nationalist uprising in 1879, Napoleon IV seized the opportunity. Determined to fulfill the dream Napoleon I never realized, he sent 60,000 troops to crush the rebellion. By 1882, France occupied Egypt completely, established a colonial administration, and Napoleon IV formally assumed the title of pharaoh. The empire then turned its gaze westward. In 1883, French forces struck Libya, taking Tripoli and Benghazi after naval bombardments, and reinstated the Karamanli dynasty as obedient French puppets. North Africa was now firmly under French dominance. In 1884, Napoleon III's great commemorative project was finally completed: the Obélisque de la Victoire and the Basilique de Saint-Clovis le Vainqueur, towering monuments erected on the Champ de Mars, inspired by Rome's Pantheon. Dedicated to Clovis, the first Catholic king of the Franks, now officially canonized, these structures celebrated French triumphs in Germany and Africa. With these monuments dominating the skyline, the Eiffel Tower was never conceived. Napoleon IV, advised by his Council of Ministers under Marshal Patrice de Marmont, recognized the growing scramble for Africa. To prevent chaos in Europe and secure their place in the colonial race, he convened the Versailles Conference, attended by France, Great Britain, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Sweden-Norway, Denmark, the United States, Spain, Portugal, Hanover, Italy, Flanders, the Netherlands, and the Ottoman Empire. The question looming over Europe was simple: would France become the unrivaled master of Africa, or would its grand alliance with Britain fracture under the weight of ambition?